I'm giving a talk this morning in the belly of the beast, and I've been wanting to give this talk for a long time and kind of struggling with how to give this talk, so I just have to begin and see what happens. And talk about race this morning, which is not an easy conversation to have. And we will be talking about a proposal that Arthi has given to our Sangha later after my talk this afternoon. So I want to begin by it seems to me, and this is just my perception, that we are living in a very difficult time right now. It is dark. And it's important to pay attention to what's going on, and it's hard to see what's going on. And there are so many things coming at us that it's easy to be overwhelmed. And what I'm going to say here, I don't mean as coming from a place of being politically one side or the other, although it will be interpreted that way. What I'm going to say, I'm saying as a human being and as someone who loves the dharma and loves the sacred world that I'm a part of. So we find ourselves in this situation where a bunch of drifters have gathered together and are following a angry, chaotic patriarch. And these corrupt con artists are squatting in the palace. This is our situation at the moment, and it's dangerous. So I want to tell you a little story about how we could do something about this by becoming protectors, each one of us. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. It's easy to feel helpless. But if we are truly practicing Zen as a spiritual path, then I think it's each of us is responsible for doing all we can to awaken and to heal the suffering, both within ourselves and in the world we find ourselves in the very difficult world we find ourselves in today. So here's the story, and this is based on in Buddhism, we have what are called the 6 realms of suffering. We have the heaven realm, we have the jealous gods or the asuras, the anti-gods, the human realm, the animal realm, the hungry ghost realm, and the hell realm. And these 6 realms are all considered to be different styles of suffering. Even the heaven realm is considered suffering from our point of view as Buddhists, because once you're in the heaven realm, it's so lovely and peaceful and pleasant that you don't want to leave there, but you can't stay anywhere. You can squat somewhere for a while, but you get kicked out eventually. And so if you're trying to stay in the heaven realm, you're going to slip back down into the asura realm or another realm. So they're all considered to be styles of suffering. Even though when you're in the heaven realm, you don't know that you're suffering. And what I'm going to talk about in this story is the asuras, the jealous god realm. And who are these? And by the way, we're all subject to all 6 realms, and we could go through all 6 in the course of a day, okay? So, but let's appreciate the nature of the asuras, the jealous gods. They are in a perpetual fight with everything. They are awash with rage, megalomania, dishonesty, acrimony. They are consumed by envy and resentment. They are mean-spirited, backbiting, competitive. You recognize this in yourself? Anyone? Or in the world somewhere? They're always playing racing to the bottom. They play a zero-sum game. They cheat, they lie, they obscure the truth. They're corrupt. And they're always complaining about how victimized they are and blaming others for their troubles. And then the question we have to ask is, what's an asura going to do when they get cornered and they realize they can no longer win? So here's a little story about the asuras and Mount Sumeru. Once upon a time, there was this Mount Sumeru, which is the center of the world in Buddhist cosmology. And Indra and the contented gods lived on the peak of Mount Sumeru, and they lived on that peak with the asuras. But the asuras were always creating a lot of turmoil and trouble. So one night, while the asuras were asleep, Indra got up and pushed them off the cliff so that they rolled down to the bottom of the mountain. And when the asuras woke up in the morning and looked out their window, they didn't see the tree of heaven, they saw the tree of earth, and they realized what had happened, and they were really pissed off. So they strapped on their armor and started marching back up the mountain. Meanwhile, Indra was organizing her troops to march down the mountain to meet them. And as Indra took her troops down the mountain, it suddenly dawned on her that she was destroying all the plant life on the mountain. She was killing wild animals everywhere because her army was so big, it was just crushing everything. So she thought twice about it and decided to retreat back up the mountain. And when the asuras saw this retreat, they couldn't understand it because they had no way of imagining that someone would do something from such an altruistic motive. They just couldn't even fathom that. So they thought, Indra must have a secret weapon that we don't know about. And they decided to stop themselves and not go any further up the mountain. And they never went up the mountain again. And after that, Indra sent 4 of her best guards down to occupy the base of the mountain so that they could contain the asuras. Now later in our Zen tradition, so these guards that she sent down the mountain were protectors. She sent them down to be protectors of the realm. And in later Zen stories, we have other more humble examples of protectors. Sometimes they're demons or foxes or a head monk or a cook in the kitchen. And in these stories, the only qualification for being a protector is that you have a sincere desire to turn your energy from causing harm to taking care. And the qualities that made you a good fox or a good cook or a good head monk or a good demon, your cleverness, your strength, your resilience, your tenacity, your cunning, now they can help you be a good protector. So imagine now a vast network of protectors hanging out in the marketplace, hanging out at the farmer's market, hanging out in the city square, in Daily Plaza. sports events. Vast network of protectors rising up. So when the asuras attack, there is something in most of us, I think all of us actually, if we're awake, that resists the chaos and the turmoil of the asuras and resists that by standing up to it, coming up, standing up and saying no more. Now, to be that protector means, how do we become a protector? I think we have to be really clear that not only, in our tradition and in our classes, we're very good at talking, in the Buddhist tradition in general, we're very good at analyzing personal suffering. And I think we do a very good job of talking about how to work with that in our classes here at the Zen Center. But we also have to be clear. I think I don't think anyone can really argue with this, that we are also subject to suffering that comes from the larger world around us, institutions and norms and culture and systemic things that are systemic to all kinds of parts of our culture. And so to become a protector, we have to begin to deal with our own trauma. Some of us have personal trauma, and if you have personal trauma, you experience that in the body. But we also have collective trauma. And my guess is, I don't know this for sure, but my guess is that pretty much all of us have some degree of collective trauma. It exists in the energetic field. What's the symptom of that trauma? We feel helpless. We feel overwhelmed. We contract. We withdraw. We watch a lot of TV. We just do this all day long. So we don't even notice the commons we're in where we could be the protector. We're totally unconscious of the commons we occupy with other sentient beings, with other protectors, because we're distracted. And part of that collective trauma is our willingness to be distracted, because if we weren't, we would have to deal with the pain and the grief and the discomfort of what's going on in our world. To be a protector, we have to come out from under the rock that we're under. And I think to some degree we're all under that rock, and we do it by another symptom of that trauma is that we feel isolated and alone, and dulled down. We dull down. And I think this is happening all across the board. So to come out from under that rock and be a protector, we can do it with, definitely we need community. We need spiritual communities like this one to help us do this. We do it together. This is a relational awakening, not just an individual, but a relational awakening. Can we become conscious again of the commons we occupy together, of the planet we're living on together? We become protectors by opening our sad and tender hearts, by finding the warmth in relationship with others and compassion, by finding humor and curiosity and a willingness to learn and to grow and to change. We become protectors by appreciating irony. We become protectors by moving our bodies in space, by dancing, by celebrating, by singing, by having joy. We become protectors by being still and really coming down and being fully embodied here in this body and finding our core of who we are here, which is unshakable, indestructible. And then we can proclaim the dharma. So that's the story. That maybe frames our situation. And we have very big problems in our world. The environmental crisis, social injustice of enormous proportions and inequality of wealth, huge gap of inequality, which is affecting everything in our culture. We're mistreating immigrants in a just shameful and illegal, immoral manner to put children, separate children from their parents and put them in cages is immoral, it's illegal, and it's wrong. We are a country of immigrants. America is based on an idea of welcoming immigrants. We're all from somewhere. Some of us more recently than others, but we're all from somewhere. And then there's gun violence. So we have these really big problems. And we're not going to solve them just by our individual practice. And I think we're at a kind of tipping point where it's becoming apparent that we don't quite know how to do it. That what is required is a collective awakening. But we don't know how to do this. Because it has to be coming alive back into the commons and being aware of the relational space we occupy together. Buddhism is relational. It's not about the parts that are related, it's about the relationship. We are totally interconnected. That's the nature of our sacred world. And if we're dulled down and distracted and then we can't even appreciate how we could be here in this way. So, in David Lloyd's excellent book on eco-dharma, he suggests as much, that we've come to a point where we need some kind of collective awakening. When it comes to the environment, green consumerism is nice, it's good to recycle, great to use less plastic, maybe change your diet, your lifestyle, but it's not going to solve the global emergency that we're facing now. It's like rearranging chairs on the deck of the Titanic. It's not going to cut it. We need policy changes. We need to change our lifestyle. We need to change our economy. We need to change our politics. And how's that going to happen? So I'm happy to say that so far what I can see is that there's the movement such as Extinction Rebellion, which is global, which seems to be a kind of collective awakening. In June, we went to their first rally, here in Daly Plaza a couple weeks ago, and it was a wonderful group of young people that were creative and articulate and passionate about the planet. And so there are these large problems, and today I want to focus on race. How to talk about race. It's a very difficult thing to talk about, and to tell you the truth, I'm kind of anxious sitting here starting this conversation with you. Race is not a biological or scientific category. It has nothing to do with blood or any kind of superiority of one group over another. It has nothing, there is no basis in that at all. It's a made-up category. It's a social construct, just like the self that we talk so much about deconstructing as part of our practice. I think I want to start this, before we go into the discussion, I'd like to do an experiential exercise, a guided meditation with you, so that we can talk about this from a place of our own experience rather than it sounding like it's just some kind of ideology or something I'm spouting up here. So I'd like you to set things down, and for this guided meditation, I'm going to talk about, I'm going to do two different kinds of guided meditations with you. One is around sameness and the other is around difference. And if you're acquainted with our tradition, you know that these are two big areas that we appreciate in our spiritual path, sameness and difference. And they're both important. So first I want you to just close your eyes. I want you to feel how your body is occupying space and the gravity of your body as it's being supported by the chair. Notice how dynamic this posture can be sitting in meditation here, how you are weighted down by gravity and kind of lifting up from your hips and your spine. Bring awareness to your breath. Relax, if you can, any parts of your body that are tense or that you're holding too tightly. See if you can let go. And just rest in your body and enjoy breathing. Enjoy breathing. Notice how your thoughts arise and fall. And notice how you are actually at the moment occupying a vast and open space that really has no boundaries. Notice how here you are completely one and interconnected with everything and everyone. How pleasant this is. There is no division here. There is peace, calmness, groundedness. Wholeness. Notice how this sameness feels. that was like? Anybody? Was that pleasing?
No anxiety.
No anxiety. It was wonderful, yeah? It was nice. This is why we meditate, isn't it? Partly it's why we meditate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyone
Yeah.
anyone meditate to be all riled up and upset?
Although it happens sometimes.
Yeah. But eventually, I think we're all meditating for this experience, aren't we?
Sure.
Partly? Be honest. Yeah. The oneness is pleasant. To be whole, to be complete, to be for a moment free of your little self that you occupy yourself with during the day. For a moment to have a glimpse of this vast open space you are a part of. The spiritual world it's great, isn't it? Do I need any more? Everyone's shaking their heads and agreeing with me, so I'm assuming you're all more or less agreeing with me that this is a pleasant experience.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. E.O. Wilson, who's a biologist, said we're the most convivial species on the planet. One of the characteristics of Homo sapiens is that we collaborate. To do things, we build and do things together. We build cities. My gosh. So now let's talk about difference. We are, as a species, we've been on this planet for a very, very long time. And one of the things that's built into us as animals, as Homo sapiens, is being able to very quickly make a distinction between the in-group and the out-group. Yeah? Our in-group is our family, our tribe, our community, our religion, whatever it is, that's our in-group. And the out-group is somebody out there that doesn't belong in our in-group, that we could easily fight, kill, destroy, and justify. We have this built into us, evolution. It's in our DNA. And if you don't believe this, think of Nazi Germany. Think of how a Nazi wakes up in the morning, has breakfast with his family, is a wonderful father, sends his kids to school, and goes off to work and kills hundreds of Jews, and comes back in the evening and plays with his children. You say, how could that be? Well, yeah, it is. And from all, if you looked at that scene, that father, that Nazi, looks perfectly normal in his family, and a loving father to boot. But he went to work and killed hundreds of people that were not in his in-group. We can do that. We have the capacity to do this. All of us, it's in our DNA. So, when we talk about difference, let's just do a little exercise. I want you to, there's a lot of us here, if you could turn, this is going to probably take a little time, find somebody you don't know so well and pair up. And I want you to just turn your chairs and look at each other. And then I'll give you guided instructions about this. But find somebody, if possible, someone you don't know too well. Pair up, turn your chairs, feel free to move things around. Does everyone have somebody?
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh no, Anna, find some, here, someone sit it on.
Dining.
Dining.
Yeah, how come?
No, I want two.
Okay. Dining right here, Robert Glenn.
Here, there's a chair here.
Just a minute. Okay, be right there.
Yeah. Okay, now I want you to, there's no talking, is everyone,
No, I don't.
you don't have somebody?
No.
Maybe
I'll tell you, come
Maybe
here.
add the number.
Vivian, come and sit where Dinah is, and Dinah, you can move the camera around.
You can be different.
I'll be different.
Yeah, Dinah, you can be different. I just want you to start this, there's going to be no talking. You just look in the face of the person in front of you. And for a little bit, I want you to notice what you have in common. Just bring some awareness to what you have in common. And how does that feel? Anyone? Pretty good?
Yeah.
Common.
Connecting.
Okay. It's not to look at someone and see what you have in common. Yeah. Okay. Now I want you to notice I want you to notice the difference. How are you different? And it may be helpful for the purposes of this exercise for you to magnify that difference. Really make it big. No talking. Okay, come back into the circle. We'll talk about that. What was that like?
It was sad.
Huh?
It was sad.
It was bad?
Sad.
Sad. Uh-huh.
Horrible.
Horrible.
It was
Horrible.
It was hard.
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 Uncomfortable?
Yeah. I wanted to keep going to the similarity, right?
Yeah,
I
sure.
wanted to keep slipping
I
out.
understand.
I
Yeah,
wanted
sure.
you to stop, I wanted you to stop.
Uh-huh. It's uncomfortable.
Very.
Yeah.
It was honest.
Wanted to stop and talk, share.
Yeah, but that would be
It
finding
would
the
be
common
relational,
ground.
right, exactly.
That would be finding the common
Yeah.
ground, yeah.
I felt smaller.
Smaller,
I felt
Uh-huh.
smaller.
yeah.
I felt ashamed, like I was being forced to judge, and I did not like it at all.
Yeah.
I was frightened of my thoughts.
Huh?
I was frightened,
Uh-huh.
frightened of how bad it got
Uh-huh.
so quickly.
Okay, so I think it's really important now at this point that we be very kind and patient with ourselves as we're going through this. And one ground rule I'm gonna say is no shaming or blaming. And white liberal guilt will not help here, so it may come up for you, but it's not gonna help. So I want you to, the useful exercise, just to notice that difference is difficult. And when we experience, and difference is an important part of our human experience. It's a very important part. It's usually where we grow. But notice that difference really disrupts the status quo, and it disrupts the self. And yet, let's think about this for a moment. How we grow up is usually the places where we grow up is around difference, not around sameness. So if we just took human development for a moment and look at that. When you are 7 or 8 years old, your parents seem like, it may not be this case for all of you, but for many of you, your parents probably seemed like gods. And you were totally identified with being whoever your family was and your family lineage and whatever came with it. And you were proud of it. And your parents could do no wrong. And then at some point, some of you may have come earlier and for some later, but you start to go into your teenage years, and things start to shift. Because now you're actually noticing all the warts and the things and the inconsistencies and the hypocrisies of your parents. And they get magnified because you're cutting your roots, you're finding your way in the world, you're growing up. And your job as a teenager is to torture your parents. Yeah? That's what I did. You may have been a good teenager, but I played Bob Dylan as loud as I could. And my mother would say, "Why are you listening to him? He can't even carry a tune." I said, "Well, that's the point." So you get to be at some point as a teenager and you're looking back at that family lineage and it doesn't look so great. And then you get into your 20s and you kind of settle down and you're finding your career, you're finding your way in the world, and your identity, notice how your identity is changing, yourself, how you are identifying. First you identify by your family, and now you're identifying by some other, nowadays identities are much more complex. Young people grow up have sexual identities that are very, in many cases, complicated, much more than when I was growing up. I was told this the other day that when people are facilitating groups with high school kids and they ask them to self-identify in terms of their sexuality, it could be he, she, or they. So, when you're in your 20s, you're starting to find your way, and your identity isn't based on reacting against your parents so much anymore. You've kind of found hopefully a positive identity about your own qualities and strengths and whatever. And then you get into your 30s and 40s, and you actually start to notice that there's a lot of things in you that are like your parents. And you actually notice there's some good qualities about your parents. So you've started to integrate the identity that you were born with a more complex identity that you're growing into. And you have a more nuanced sense of who you are. That isn't just your parents, but it's not, it includes your parents now. You see what I'm saying? And if you think about how you grew through those periods, a lot of it was upsetting. And being a teenager is rough work. It's rough. But that's where we're growing. We grow around difference. That's where we grow and learn. It's not usually comfortable. Yeah? Now, I think there's a tendency in Zen for us to see the sameness. It's all right. There's a lot of division in the world, and we do a lot of healing by seeing the sameness. But here's the problem. If we conflate sameness and difference, then we're really missing a huge piece of the human experience of how we identify our identities, and we're actually discounting it to some degree. Let me give you an example of how that has worked in our, because I think part of this conversation is we want to start having a larger, hopefully, awareness of our social, cultural context in which we find ourselves as Americans, as a history. And as I've been learning about this myself, I've learned a lot of things that are really kind of shocking to me. So, for instance, there's a picture here, I'll pass it around. You know the term melting pot? You know where that came from? Yeah, that's this one. This is a melting pot that was part of a naturalization program at the Ford Motor Company for their employees in Detroit. Where's Detroit? Michigan. Yeah. And they actually built, so they have thousands of employees that became American citizens. They went through this naturalization program. And at the graduation program, they came to this stage that had this big melting pot they had built with stairs going into it. And as part of the graduation ceremony, to become assimilated as an American citizen, you would wear your ethnic clothing to the graduation ceremony, your Scottish kilt, or Irish, whatever Irish wear, or Germans, Japanese, Chinese, yeah. You wear your ethnic clothing, your best ethnic clothing that you have. You walk into the melting pot, and some guys would stir some oars to stir it up. And as they were stirring it up, you would take off you go into a little room in the melting pot, remove your ethnic clothing, put on a suit, come out, and you're handed an American flag, and you walk out of the pot. Now, I think the association most of us have about melting pot is supposed to be some great, wonderful thing about how diverse we are. But in fact, we have actually paid a price to assimilate. It's not all bad. I mean, countries have to assimilate to function. But notice what has happened in our history of assimilation. We have actually lost, in many cases, the memory of where we came from. So, white didn't exist. White people. White didn't exist before 1681. Didn't exist. Our pre-colonial history is kind of shocking when I started reading about it, because I have this, I was socialized and I learned this romantic idea about the revolution and how we were Paul Revere and how we overcame the British and through tea and the Tea Party and how we were so great and brave and you know, yeah, some of that I'm sure is true, but the really, if you look at the economics of how we were founded, in the mid 17th century, in the 1600s, the primary economy of the eastern colonies of Maryland and Virginia was tobacco farming, and it was very labor intensive. So the British happened to have a population explosion at this time, and so there were a lot of people in Britain on the dole. And the king says, you know what, let's put these people under contract and make them be itinerant laborers, send them on ships over to the colonies, and make them sign a contract that they will be an itinerant laborer for 7 to 14 years. In other words, they are basically the owner of the tobacco farmer for 17 to 14 years. And then we can get them off the dole, we'll get them out of Britain, great. And then the colonies will be happy because the tobacco farmers will have lots of laborers. And that's what they did. And most of the laborers were European, British. They weren't Africans at that point. There were some. There was some slavery. But before the Bacon's Rebellion, which happens in the late 1600s, there were workers, itinerant laborers and slaves that would get freed from time to time. The slave owner might write in his will something that would release the slave from slavery, or the slave might buy their way out of it in some way. The itinerant laborers would end their term of service and hopefully not get penalized by breaking some rule and having their service increased by another 9 or 10 years. And then there were these free people then, living and working and sleeping and intermarrying together. And whether you were African or indigenous Indian or European or whatever, you're all in the same category. You were all able to vote, you were able to own land, you were able to own slaves. There was no difference. They weren't differentiated. And then what happened is the population explosion stopped in England. The labor pool dried up, and now the tobacco farmers start making stricter rules and punishments so that if someone breaks a rule, they have to work longer on the tobacco farm. If someone intermarries with the wrong person, they get penalized. They add another, so they're increased, and they encourage the laborers to break the rules because then they could get more property. They needed the property to grow the tobacco. But the rules were so harsh and restrictive that the workers started to rise up. It was really untenable. And you have the Bacon's Rebellion taking place towards the third part of around 1670s maybe. And it was a rebellion of workers, Europeans and Africans. At first they were actually fighting indigenous people, and then it was the landowners. And the landowners paid attention to this because all these laborers were organizing together, and they were quite a force when they were organized together. And they finally sent forces from Britain to stop the rebellion. They put it down. But it made a big impression on the tobacco farmers because they realized that the status quo was threatened. And so they did something very consciously, and they did it by making laws of who could marry who. And they created for the first time the word white. And they consciously practiced divide and conquer. They did this consciously. It wasn't haphazard. They said, we need to divide the Europeans from the blacks. And they did. They created, for the first time, the term white. If you're from European and you look British in some way, you're a white person. And you're better than the Africans. Now, they created this differentiation among the workers so that the whites would feel a little better. They weren't near to where the elites were, the landowners, economically. They were still lower middle class. But the blacks got put way down here. So now the workers are saying, oh, we're better than the whites because we're white. We're better than the blacks because we're white. And then there wasn't any more rebellion because the workers couldn't organize together. And the whites weren't paying attention to the tobacco farmers anymore, or the elites. They were paying attention to the blacks. So they were divided. Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's the foundation, and then the laws, basically, the foundational laws on which our country are based are white supremacy. White supremacy is foundational in our legal system all the way up through 1970s. Foundational. It's part of white supremacy was written into our legal codes. It was encoded in our laws. So that's part of our history. And I think it's important to just, without, look, the problem with race and why I think it's so sensitive, especially for white people, is that when we hear about race or racism, we feel like that's the worst possible thing. For me to be racist means I'm really a bad person. And so I think we are almost fragile about race, because when we hear about racism and we feel like we're being blamed for it, then we react. Who wouldn't? So this isn't a matter of blaming anybody. We're not to blame, but we are responsible. Responsibility. Respond means able to respond. Now, if we, every time the notion of race comes up, we just shut down because we're in the grip of some collective trauma around this, which I believe we are, then we don't have the ability to respond. Do you see? We react. We shut down. We dull down. I'm not going to have the conversation. There's a Zen, I'm sure you've all heard a Zen story. Someone asked the Zen teacher, what's the essence of Zen? And the teacher says, an appropriate response. An appropriate response. What is an appropriate response for us today, at this time, in this place, where we are, as a spiritual community that has all kinds of resources and strengths, and all kinds of skills for working with suffering in ourselves and with others. We know how to do counsel, we know how to be together, we know how to be with our discomfort. Hopefully, if you're practicing, you are able to some degree to be brave and like just that exercise with difference and be with the discomfort of it and not just run away. Isn't that part of what our practice is about? So I think if we could frame this discussion and we could move towards this in an organic way that is allows us all to come along with it, I think we could move towards being a more diverse spiritual community. And by diversity, I mean all kinds of diversities: demographics, youth, race, people of color, people with different sexual orientations, and we would be stronger for it. And I don't think it's just going to happen. I think we actually have to do some kind of inner work ourselves for this to happen. And for us to do this work, again, I think one of the most important ground rules is safety and no shame and blaming, and being very respectful of everyone and everyone's point of view, and not worrying too much about being politically correct. It's okay to say something screwy if that's what you're feeling, because that's how we learn. And if we're all on pins and needles about this and walking on eggshells, then we won't actually do it. We won't do the work that we need to do in order to really become strong and vital as a spiritual community. Healthy ecosystems are diverse. Think of the rainforest or the Amazon, how diverse that ecosystem is. That's a healthy ecosystem. And part of what's happening in our world is our ecosystems aren't so healthy anymore. Think of the oceans and the coral and the acidifying of the oceans. The ecosystems are threatened. And as they become threatened, they become less diverse. And diverse is not such a easy thing to get at what it is. Diversity is a complex concept. There's diversity and there's variety. Variety is a quantitative index of our difference, and we can see it by looking around the room. The color of our skin, the color of our hair, the color of our eyes, whether we're female or male, that's something you can count. It's a quantitative index. But diversity is a qualitative index of our differences, that how we differ well. it's a qualitative index of, it's not, you can't count it, you can't visually see it. But it's how we as a community allow difference to emerge and enrich our common work together. And if you think I'm making that up, let me just read you something from our Zen tradition that goes back from the 6th or 7th century. This is from Fayan, the great Zen teacher. And he's talking about non-duality. Fasan. He said, non-duality is not a bland erasing of our differences, it's the activation of our difference as a basis for generating patterns of mutual contribution so everyone can realize freedom from conflict and suffering. Isn't that amazing?
One more time, please.
Yes. Non-duality is not a bland erasing of our differences. The paper, just bland smorgasbord. It's the activation of our difference as the basis of generating patterns of mutual contribution so everyone can realize freedom from conflict and suffering. Realize patterns of mutual contribution. In other words, it's how to differ well. How well we differ from each other. That's really what diversity is about. And again, I think our tendency in our practice, and it's totally understandable, is that we tend to conflate sameness and difference. And I think we're living in a world now where difference has, identities are important. And you can say, oh, it's identity politics, it's disgusting, it's everywhere. But it's part of our world. There is a more complex identity in our world, especially with young people. And we're talking forever about how we want to attract young people here. Well, if we do want to attract that kind of diversity in our spiritual community, we need to acknowledge and recognize that those people are coming in here with much more complex identities than we grew up with. And part of their spiritual practice is going to be negotiating that identity that they're working with, and it's complicated. So part of our practice needs to be honoring the difference and seeing it, acknowledging it, and celebrating it as something that enriches all of us. But notice that when we did that exercise, how difference can seem exciting at first, but it very easily moves into feeling threatened and fearful. So we kind of got this built into our genes. So I think part of practicing with difference is we need to normalize discomfort. Normalize it. It's not going to always be comfortable. And can we stay? And if we can kind of turn into that skid, then I think we have the possibility of growing and being a much stronger spiritual community that's more resilient and can be of service in the larger community, which I know many of us have the aspiration to do, but we don't quite know how to do it. Wow, that already took up the hour. I'm sorry I talked too long. There might be some questions or comments. Carol, you want to take the microphone?
I think it's important for us to also be aware of our language. Because when you started off and you talked about us being protectors, that's a very paternal, white way of approaching diversity. And it can be assumed to be heroic in that way. And I think we just have to be careful in our language when we're doing this work. And I think we have to be careful about identities, because we can say there was no white before X time because we are white. And so it's important to, it's okay that we're doing it, and that's what you're trying to create, is the safety in this language. But the language that we have is also rooted in a systemic misogyny, racism, that we have to really also be with that discomfort of that. So,
Actually, yeah. Just one note on language. You at one point you mentioned the usage of the term "them." That's not a sexuality. Like, just make sure to differentiate between sexuality and gender when you're talking about that. And at one point you talk about men and women. You know, there's more than two genders. So there's a spectrum. You know.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Roshi, first of all. A great hour to think about. So you talked a lot about being relational. And one of the difficulties I think we have in this society that we're in is that, unfortunately, it's a transactional society. And so when we have conversations with people, when we're trying to have a relational conversation, it often moves to, okay, what are you going to do for me? And that makes having a relational conversation extremely difficult. I don't have the answer for that, except that I continually try to have a relational conversation, but it is not easy and often gets abruptly ended by a person or persons being aggravatingly angry. Aggravating to me, and they're probably aggravated too. I don't know.
Yes, I think language is important. We have to be careful about the words we use. We might use ally instead of protector, but I think we also shouldn't worry too much about saying the wrong word and being politically correct, because then we can't even have a conversation. We're all learning here. I'm learning. So I think it's important to allow ourselves to say what we say and learn from what we say and the words we use, that we all have an intention to be kind and respectful and to learn. And it's really important that we not shame each other or blame each other for using the wrong words, or and that it be okay to use whatever words you use, and they may not be so skillful, and we'll learn as we go along. But I think the most important thing here is safety, and safety, that we be really deeply respectful of each other and everyone's point of view, and that we're walking into a minefield that is full of all kinds of things that can blow up. And so we need to do this with kindness and gentleness and respect, and really try to listen and learn from each other. We're doing this together. It's not, as I think Mark put it very well, it's not transactional, it's relational. And we're all in this boat together.
I've read a book called Light Fragility, and the essence is that white liberals are very sensitive to being called, to feel like they're racist. And that's really a different way. What I think about is that if I woke up in the morning and I was black, I have to think about what I'm going to do during the day and where I'm going to do it. So it isn't anything, I could be just a really, I don't know another word, perfect person, but I still am white, and I still get something for being white, and that's different than whether I'm racist or not racist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
True.
I want to thank you for this new idea of being responsible to, as opposed to being responsible for.
Mhm.
Because I think I started a place where some things just generally relationally, well, I'm not responsible for that. And then it stops me from taking any action to move forward to responsible to. So, you know, I'm sitting here listening to you, and there's a part of me that has a commentary to make myself feel like I get it and I'm part of it and it's wonderful. And then there's this bridge that I fail to cross, which is the action part. Am I going to show up at the next circle? Am I going to, you know, what kind of a commitment does it mean for me to even open my mouth about this? And I think that's what I have to work through. What's stopping me? You know, what is stopping me from going across it? Why is there even a bridge? Like, why do I feel so passionate inside, but I can't get myself? So I'm like, I'm going to say nothing, and I think that's the right thing, but it really is the non-action thing. So, all right, thanks.
I'm always looking for the differences instead of the similarities, and